Welcome everybody to the series of webinars on innovations at high-performing charter schools in Illinois. The series is made possible through an ISB contract with Measurement Incorporated and the Senseo Group. I'm Sarah Silva from Measurement Incorporated, and my colleague Tanya Yarosevich is from Senseo. Please wave, Tanya. Thank you. And on our support team is Abby Jacobs from Measurement Incorporated, who will be our technical troubleshooter today. Abby, say wave. Thank you. And you can chat to her if you're having any technical issues. Now, today's presentation is about a model for student-led teaching. Why do high-performing charter schools undertake this? And how do they structure something so bold in their high schools? What do students gain? Let's find out. So this webinar is being recorded and will be archived in the Best Practices corner of the Charter Schools page of the ISB website. We're keeping all attendees muted till it's time to participate, and at that time, you can unmute yourself, and if you have a question, speak it out, or you can use a raise hand function that appears in the reactions box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you can also drop questions into the chat box as you think of them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters. Take it away, team.
All right, hello everyone. We are so happy to have you here with us as we start to talk about the Harkness method and student-led teaching. To get us started, we want to make sure that we can formally introduce all of ourselves. My name is Paige Moran. I am one of the assistant principals at Pritzker College Prep. We also have Tamar Schwartzman, who is a civics teacher at the Noble Academy, Rebecca Wessels, who is a dean of instruction at the Noble Academy, and Teddy Schreischun, who is a math teacher at Pritzker. You'll have a chance to hear from all four of us today, and they will introduce themselves once again when it's their section. But we wanted to make sure that you at least have a name to a face as you start to see us all formally present throughout the presentation today. So to start us off, the goal here is that we're going to be talking about the Harkness method and student-led learning, but it does apply to several of the Illinois early learning and development standards, and so we want to highlight those for you here. The first standard is 30, which is students developing self-awareness and self-management skills, and Harkness is a vehicle to do so. The second is standard 31, which is using social awareness and interpersonal skills to establish and maintain positive relationships. Again, through interaction between students, they are building these social awareness and interpersonal skills, and we'll make this clear throughout our presentation today. And then the third and final goal is 32, which is demonstrate decision-making skills and responsible behaviors. Really, the Harkness method is meant to really build students' ability on some of those soft skills we want them leaving high school with, their ability to behave and make decisions and communicate with each other in personal situations, in school, and in eventually their professional lives. So the Harkness method really helps us develop all three of these different Illinois learning standards and these goals. All right, so the first thing we would like to do is just get a sense of who's here and what your experience with student-led learning has been in the past. We know that educators love to have students talk and have students work with one another, but sometimes it can be really successful and sometimes it can flop. And so we want to see, like, what does the experience been like for you? So the first question I want to ask is, how often do you utilize student-led discussion in your classroom? How often do you utilize student-led discussion in your classroom? So if you want to take a minute to just answer that question, how often do you utilize student-led discussion in your classroom? And you should be able, if you've never used a webinar poll, to just answer directly on your screen and it will show up. We'll give about 30 more seconds. So it's looking like for many of our participants that people use it quite frequently, that they're finding that they use student-led learning at least once a week. And so this is a great place for us to start, because this is really going to help us allow you to build your repertoire of what student-led learning can be in your classroom. And the second question we want to ask is, knowing that you do use student-led learning in your classroom, what are some of the biggest frustrations that you as an educator often face with student-led discussion? So you can see there's lots of different things listed there, so check any that might apply. We'll give people about 30 to 40 seconds to answer that poll. What are the biggest frustrations with student-led discussion? You can check any and all that apply. Okay, so we only had a couple people answer that one, but one thing that was really common that a lot of people said was a shallow discussion. They felt like the discussion wasn't as deep as they wanted it to be. And I think that the Harkness model will start to address that for the people listening to the presentation today, because the goal of Harkness is to really make sure that there is depth and breadth to a conversation that students are having. So before we start and get into the meat of our presentation today, I want to first make sure that everyone has an idea of what they will hopefully walk away with. So the first thing is an overview of the Harkness method. What is it? Where did it come from? Kind of generally, how can you think of it? The second is Harkness classroom culture. We know that the foundation to any good classroom is culture and making sure that students have a safe environment. So we're going to walk you through how do you build that safe environment, especially around something like discussion that can be a little bit intimidating for students. The third section is classroom implementation. So once you have the culture set, how does Harkness actually work? How might it work in different subjects? What does it look like? And then fourth is a section that I think is really insightful in terms of like theory to practice, which is great. This is all good and I get it. Good culture. This is how it works. But then how does this actually work in a classroom that has lots of moving parts and lots of moving pieces? So to make sure that you have a way to just organize yourself, we also wanted to make sure that you had access to a graphic organizer. So in the chat right now, I'm going to put a link to a graphic organizer. This is just a place for you to take notes, write questions as you have them. This will force you to make a copy, so don't feel like you need to make a copy of this document, but the graphic organizer is there if you'd like to take notes as we go through our presentation today. And then lastly, if you do have a question, you can type your questions directly to Tamar Schwartzman in the chat. Just find her name. We will have a section Q&A after each section so that people can ask questions about each section as we go and make sure that we can really explore the things that you're wondering you might want a little more information on. Okay, so the first section we're going to go over is the overview of the Harkness method. What is it? Where did it come from? Why should we care? So we're going to start there. So first, where did Harkness come from? Harkness came from Phillips Exeter Academy, which is in New Hampshire. It's a very prestigious boarding school in New Hampshire. It costs quite a bit to go there. But Exeter's goals when they use the Harkness methods are the following. They use the Harkness to make sure that students can think, discuss, question, and analyze. They want students to use Harkness and sort of walk away combining a knowledge with also a goodness, or a want to explore the world and try to solve its problems. And then lastly, they use Harkness to build a student's level of learning and a lifelong commitment to helping others. And that's fostered through both the method itself and the interactions that students have with one another. At the center of the Harkness philosophy is this idea that can students learn if there is no teacher with all the right answers? So in our typical classroom model, there is a teacher, a central figure who has the answer. But Harkness has really flipped that model and say, can students still learn and walk away with an in-depth knowledge when teachers aren't the center of the room and may not have the right answers? And in this Harkness philosophy, or in this Harkness model, there's three things that I think are key to understanding it. The first is students really step up and they are the ones that become the teachers. They are the ones that are teaching each other. The second is students are going to choose the path and the goal. So the teacher might provide them with a problem, but the students are providing the path and the goal. And then lastly, communication and collaboration are key. That's a central tenet of the Harkness philosophy, because without those two pieces, students aren't going to be able to effectively communicate with each other. So what is Harkness? Now we're going to go in much more detail in other sections of this webinar, but this is just a brief overview of how can you sort of orient yourself to how this might be different than other student-led discussion models. So on the left, you'll see something that we would maybe call like a traditional model. At the very front of the room, you see the teacher, and that teacher is disseminating information to the students. And the students might give information back, and then the teacher gives information back to the students, but it's kind of a teacher and student back and forth process. The right is a picture of what a Harkness circle might look like. And the Harkness table is very pivotal like image for what Harkness looks like at Exeter. Students are around a big wooden table and the teacher is sometimes not even at the table, and students are communicating back and forth. But what I think is important to note about the right is that the lines are all between students. The instructor is maybe there in the table, they might be on the outside, but really the communication is happening between students. And as that communication and that exchange of ideas happens between students, we start to see all of these words on the screen appear. We see students collaborating, they're discussing, they're provoking the ideas from each other, they're engaging in new ideas with each other, they're interacting with each other. And these lines draw across the table between students and among students as they build this knowledge based on some sort of question they have. And if you go back to the beginning, remember we said that students are the ones who determine the path to get to their question. And this circle is helping facilitate what that path might be, because they are going to determine how are we going to come up with a solution to this problem. So some of you might be sitting here thinking like, okay, I get it, Harkness, they're communicating with this, but how is this really different than other student-led discussion models? I think a common one that we can draw a distinction between is something like the Socratic method. The Socratic teaching method involves asking students questions about their ideas. And then once a teacher asks a question about that idea, the instructor's job in many ways is to start to point out weaknesses in that idea. Say, okay, yes, that's the idea, but here's where I want you to go differently, or here's where I want you to think down a different path. This type of teaching is still teacher-centered because the teacher is asking the question, students are giving responses, and the teacher is still redirecting the student. A really clear distinction you can make in your mind for what Harkness is that imagine that same scenario, but now the students are really driving the discussion. So a teacher might ask an initial question, but they are not filling in the gaps of silence. They are not redirecting the students' discussion. The students are the ones guiding the conversation and determining the path. It's something that's going to happen organically rather than something that is predetermined. So the teacher is not going to be able to say to the students, you're going to answer this question in this exact way. They're going to have to allow the students to really go up and down and around corners until they get to that final solution, but really let them drive that path. And the teacher in a Harkness classroom is really a facilitator versus instructor. They might be on the outside creating some guardrails as students start to get super off track, but for the most part, they're allowing this discussion to flow and develop as students determine their own path towards an answer. So now that you have kind of a little bit of a background of big picture what Harkness looks like, it's important to also mention why is this something that we as schools decided to do. We have presenters here from both the Noble Academy and Pritzker, and both schools use Harkness in different ways, and we'll talk through what that looks like. But essentially why it even came to Pritzker or the Noble Academy is that the Noble Network, which both of our schools are part of, initially started to invite students to attend a summer program at Exeter. This was a place where our students in Chicago would go to Exeter for the summer, and they would learn the Harkness model, do the Harkness model of teaching in classrooms. And we found that when those students came back from the summer program, they in many ways outperformed students on a lot of different metrics. They came back able to have more in-depth discussions, and that meant that through both their grades, their performance on standardized tests, they were really outperforming their peers. And so initially, Pritzker asked Exeter teachers to come and train its Pritzker teachers in Harkness methods so that we could start to use the Harkness method in certain classes. And when we saw that it was very effective, the Noble Network opened an additional high school called the Noble Academy, and they are wall-to-wall Harkness, meaning they essentially have Harkness classrooms across the board. So whereas Pritzker, the school that I teach at, kind of has pockets of Harkness, the Noble Academy is wall-to-wall. But in both schools, we've seen the impact that Harkness has and continues to have on students' ability to not only perform well on standardized tests, but also be able to communicate both in high school and their post-secondary life. So in the end, and this is kind of going to close out our section on what the overview of Harkness, these are listed the 7 different pillars of the Harkness model. You know, if you look through these 7 ideas, you can see things like listen carefully, speak respectfully, accept new ideas, question old ideas, enjoy human interactions. All of these things, when you really look down to it, they are all just a list of things we want students to do when they leave high school. If these are all things that if we are thinking about developing students' minds so that they can be critical citizens of the world and, you know, bring something out of high school and start to build their own life. We want people to listen to each other. We want people to speak respectfully. We want them to question old ideas with new knowledge. We want them to enjoy the human interactions they have. And so really Harkness is about communicating. And it's a method to kind of solve a problem that's academic based, but it's also a method to solve this problem, which is like, how do we build good human beings that are going to go out and change the world in ways that we all know they're capable of? So this is kind of the goal of Harkness, which is building these critical minds for our students. I'm going to now have just a quick Q&A if people had any questions on the overview before we get into the culture aspect of the Harkness model. Tamar, were there any specific questions?
Not yet. No.
Okay, so that's just because I did such a great job presenting. No, I'm joking. So I'm gonna now hand it over to Tamar, who is going to talk us through how might you set up the cultural aspect or the foundation of this Harkness classroom to make sure that students feel like they are able to take the risks needed.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paige. Actually, we did just receive a question from Carrie Spitz, who asked, is Harkness only meant for certain kids? And that's a really great question. And I think that we'll be able to touch on that as we go through the presentation about in which classrooms, how to make this work in your classroom. And so thank you for that question. And if we don't hit on it, then please feel free to ask again. Awesome. All right. Thank you, Paige. Once again, my name is Tamar Schwartzman, and I am a 9th grade teacher at the Noble Academy. And thanks so much for taking time out of your evening to join us. In this section, I will be covering the process for onboarding Harkness culture. I want to note that these are from one personal experience in a humanities classroom. There is no one specific direction that you absolutely must take. However, what is an overarching necessity in the preparation for new Harkness students is a main focus on helping students build feelings of resiliency. We need students to feel willing to take academic risks and see a value in sometimes being wrong. A key for onboarding in Harkness culture is the development of soft skills. I'm fortunate enough to teach ninth graders, students that are both new to Harkness and new to high school. For about the first 6 weeks of school, students are seated in rows, and the structure of the class resembles a gradual release or an I do, we do, you do model. During this time, as any teacher does, is use this time to intentionally build meaningful student-teacher relationships and student-to-student relationships. The main focus for the first 6 weeks is to genuinely get to know your students as people and build investment in your course. After the first 6 weeks of school, students will transition to sit in small groups of 4. Over the next 4 weeks or so, as we are mainly focusing on teamwork and collaboration skills, students will be tasked with purposeful activities I will speak more about on the next slide, that help build the soft skills needed for Harkness. The Harkness culture are the expectations that are set, expectations that are either chosen by you, the teacher, or the class as a whole of these soft skills. Make sure that your expectations for the soft skills are specific and explain the why behind having expectations for soft skills, such as how we treat each other, which ultimately creates an environment for learning. Now, if you take a look at the top right corner where it says consistent reflection on teamwork and soft skills throughout, that is where the secret sauce lies. We can name our expectations, but the reflection piece helps both hold students accountable and internalize their impact on the learning community. Students both reflecting on their previous experience working with teams and how they are doing now helps build a vision of what an effective team looks like, and they are able to imagine what their role will be and how they will contribute when they begin to Harkness. So this slide has a list of examples or organizations or curriculums that produce either content-rich or socially emotional activities that help students prepare for Harkness. I rely heavily on these organizations, such as the Stanford History Education Group. The Choices program from Brown University is a curriculum that I think can be adapted to nearly every course content, and it provides a lot of great material for Harkness. And then Facing History and Ourselves provides a lot of social emotional activities, and it also works well in a humanities classroom. So you've made it to your first day of Harkness. Now what do? This day is certainly a memorable day for both you and your students. And so here are 3 key things that can help build momentum for your Harkness classroom. On the first day, resilience and risk-taking are the driver. Content takes the passenger seat. I know that sounds scary, and it feels almost irresponsible to not use every possible minute to teach content. However, this day is an investment in Harkness and the rest of the course. So choose something that is content relevant, and relatively a lower cognitive lift. It sounds strange, but on the first day of Harkness, we want students to focus on tackling the social emotional skills of sitting at this round table for the first time where they are the drivers, and not focusing so much in that moment on the rigorous content. An option here is to give students the questions ahead of time to prepare, to build confidence, and then have a gradual release of more in the moment, on the fly, as you progress through your journey. On the note and word of journey, for number 2 is to encourage the mindset that Harkness truly is an academic journey. It's a process, and it was helpful for me to name for my students that probably everyone at the table, including myself, felt nervous. My goal for day one is to hear every voice at the table at least once, and saying, I agree, or can you repeat yourself, counts, because we would be surprised that actually can feel very difficult for a student who may be more shy during discussions. And the third key is to reflect. Plan for time at the end of the discussion to reflect. If a pro tip is to prepare a reflection sheet where students silently write their answer and then share their responses aloud. Reflection builds camaraderie, and it will help you get to higher quality Harkness at a faster pace. And you can use their reflections to drive the next conversation. I know that I said I was only going to give you 3 pointers, but I would be remiss to not emphasize the significance of the teacher practicing to embrace silence. As teachers, we have a reflex to jump in at any lull or moment of silence. And a challenge is to try to sit with that silence for a little and allow the students to really do the cognitive lift. So on this next slide is an example of what my class came up with for what team building, effective team building looks like. And the students got really specific about what an effective team's body language looks like, what they are saying, and what an effective team produces. And they were able to reference this. It was posted on their first day of Harkness to have something to fall back on if they were stuck and they needed a reminder of the goals that they've set for themselves. I will leave this up for about 10 more seconds if you would like to just skim through. And then we will transition to the Q&A portion of this section. And so I'm going to click the next slide, which should be our Q&A. Here it is. I see a question in the chat about Harkness during remote learning. Thank you, Michael, for submitting this question. So the question is, has it been possible to use Harkness during remote instruction during COVID? And if so, how have you done it? I personally have not implemented Harkness during remote instruction for my class because it felt like a big barrier to build this authentic relationship and community online. So I personally have not done that. And I'm not sure if other teachers at Pritzker may have.
I have not. This is Teddy from Pritzker speaking. I have not implemented Harkness either. I use Harkness style discussions for culture building and to build community, but not to learn new content during remote learning. It's for the same reasons Tamar mentioned.
I can also jump in. I'm Rebecca at TNA. Exeter themselves sort of shifted away from the Harkness model during the pandemic until they were able to get some of their students back on campus and they could use those like OWL cameras. There are other ways that teachers have been able to generate discussions in remote learning. Nearpod has a really awesome way in which students can post like Post-it notes on a collaborative board and like each other's responses, and they can respond to each other. TNA uses a online platform called GoFormative, so students can record audio responses to questions. So I know teachers have been able to use those audio responses to generate not necessarily a Harkness conversation that we'd see in person, but allows students to articulate and formulate different thoughts in regards to different topics.
And your question, Michael, just reminds me of how crucial Harkness is going to be this upcoming school year after a year and a half of almost independent learning and helping these students transition back to the soft skills that they miss of working with their peers. And so I'm really excited to Harkness with the new 9th graders that will be coming in the fall. And so now I have the pleasure of handing it over to my colleague, Rebecca Wessels.
Thank you, Tamar. Let me just make sure I get my screen minimized. Paige, do I have remote control access? Awesome, seeing the thumbs up, great. So Tamar did a great job spotlighting some of the important things she thinks through before Harknessing with her students. And she did talk about that very first day of Harkness and what you as the facilitator should be thinking about. And there are some other things we want to think about before the first day of Harkness. So Tamar said a strong classroom culture is essential for students to engage in a Harkness discussion. She spends almost an entire quarter building those skills into our students before they even begin a Harkness discussion. There are 4 other key elements that you want to think about in order to create an environment in which you'll have those conversations. The number one thing I think we can all say is the relationships at the Harkness table, and that's the teacher to student relationship and the student to student relationship. Without trust, a Harkness conversation isn't going to get off the ground because students need to be able to trust in each other and in you in order to be vulnerable and make mistakes and take risks. Students also need to know what to expect of you as the facilitator and what your role is going to be during a Harkness conversation. They need to know that you're going to hold them accountable for their student norms and that you'll be posing questions to push them along and that you'll give them feedback. In addition, they also need to know what to expect of each other. As you saw on Tamar's slide, those students generated a lot of those expectations of how they expect each other to behave at the Harkness table. In addition, if you think back to Paige's slide, one of the expectations is for students to talk to each other at the oval. So you saw in the oval, the lines are drawn between the students and not just between the student and you as the teacher. And then finally, what are the norms students can expect to be held accountable as well at the Harkness table? A great thing that I've seen Tamar do is she has those conversations with her students and co-creates the norms with them. So they're more invested in them throughout the Harkness conversation. On the next slide, we'll see some of those specific student-generated norms created by Tamar's class. Respect and integrity, your vibe affects the class. One voice at a time and practice active listening skills. To think is greater to know. Make mistakes, take risks. 100% of the effort, 100% of the time. And Tamar, every day at the start of her class, would have students read out those norms before they begin discussing anything in Harkness, to just constantly go back to those expectations. The next thing you'll want to think about is the logistical setup of Harkness. Exeter has the luxury of 12-person classes, which most of us don't. So you really have to think about how you're going to logistically execute a Harkness conversation in a room of probably 25 students. There's really 2 routes you could go. The first is the entire class Harknessing at the same time, or you could have one group Harknessing at a time. If you decide to have the entire class Harknessing at the same time, you'll want to think about how you'll divide the class up. How many groups are you going to have? As Tamar said, the ideal size is between 8 to 12 students. You might also want to think about specifically how are you going to create those groups? Are they going to be based on skill level? Are they going to be varied? And then finally, where will you be positioned if you have multiple tables going at the same time? Will you sit in the middle of the room so you can sort of pick up on moments in each conversation, or will you sit at a table and rotate between all the tables during a conversation? If you decide to have one group Harknessing at a time, you'll have to think about how you'll create the groups as well. But what you really need to think about is what will students do who are not Harknessing? You want to make sure they're engaging in some independent work that they can complete without a lot of teacher support. That way you can be fully present in the Harkness conversation. And then another thing you'll want to think about is the length of the conversation in that setting. Will one group Harkness per day, or will they rotate within a class period? And that's going to vary depending on your Harkness conversation that day and the topic. I think I clicked ahead. Okay, so there are three major things you want to think about before you start a Harkness conversation. The number one question is why? Why did you decide to have your students Harkness that day with that specific lesson? You'll want to ask yourself, how does this Harkness conversation align with the bigger objectives of the unit or my daily objectives? And then finally, timing. Did you allot enough time for a productive and meaningful conversation? If you're trying to have a Harkness conversation in 7 minutes, it probably won't get very deep. And I know someone had left on the poll that they felt sometimes student conversations were shallow. The first few times you're Harkness, your timing might feel really off, and that's totally okay. It's sort of the same as being comfortable with the silence. It will take a while to figure out the sweet spot for your discussion lengths, given what you're choosing to discuss and given the personalities at the table. And you just can't always predict where the conversation's going to go, but that's the fun of Harkness too. So Harkness isn't just have your students come to a table and discuss something. There are some ways to approach the different conversations you might want to have. These different approaches go from more, they range from less instructor involvement with the bubble up approach to more involvement in planning with the top-down model. So the bubble up approach is the idea of letting students sort of work their way through material they're unfamiliar with, so something they may not have background information on. The discussion is purely exploratory. You don't have a set agenda of where the conversation needs to go by the end of the discussion, so it's not like you're working towards some essential question that must be answered. And students can come prepared with questions ahead of time, or they can come up organically during the discussion. The next, with more planning and more facilitator involvement, would be from the general to the particular. So this conversation begins with a broad interpretive question, larger theme, and an essential question, and then you would move to more particulars through the conversation. This assumes that you'll understand and see what student command of the material is as the discussion progresses. The opposite of that is from the particular to the general. So this is a conversation that starts honing in on something specific. So think of a close read where you select a very specific paragraph that you want students to discuss and analyze first. Then you would switch to the more general discussion. And then finally, a top-down approach. The top-down approach is when you as the instructor do have a set agenda that you want students to get from point A to point B in the length of the conversation. It might be deriving a formula or understanding why the United States dropped the atomic bomb. It's driven to a greater degree by content coverage than other conversations might be. And then your sequence of questions you might want to develop ahead of time so you're able to keep the conversation moving forward as necessary. As you can see in all four of the approaches, your questions that you will create and ask throughout the discussion will play a central role. And you want to make sure you've thought about those ahead of time so you know when to jump in and when not to jump in. I'm now going to discuss the implementation in the 4 specific core content areas and the ways in which you could go about thinking through Harkness, whether you're science, math, ELA, or a social studies teacher. There we go. So in the science classroom, science can get kind of tricky because the science contents can really vary. I have taught physics and chemistry in the Harkness method, so I know that they can really differ in terms of content and skills that are taught. Chemistry is sort of this weird hybrid between reading and math, whereas physics is really heavy math. However, no matter what, if you're Harknessing in science, you want to think about what's the goal and the objective of the discussion, and what key understandings do you want students to walk away with? And then what are the questions you can pose to help guide them if needed? The 3 ways to think about Harkness in a science classroom is the first is discovery learning. So this would have students to arrive at a conclusion without you explicitly teaching them the answer. So think of giving students a set of data on force, mass, and acceleration, and you ask students to determine what the relationship is between those three variables, with the hope and goal by the end of the conversation, students have derived the formula for Newton's second law, force equals mass times acceleration. The other way you could use Harkness in a science classroom is with practice and more rigorous application. So this is when students take the skills they have learned and use them in new analogous situations or additional practice. So again, going back to Newton's second law, this is when you could ask students what happens if you double the force, triple the mass, and play with the variables and how their relationship could change. Finally, Harkness is a really great tool to use when you want to have a lab discussion, because this allows students to discuss their findings and drive towards some sort of larger understanding with the lab. You could also have students discuss and analyze their own data in comparison with their classroom data and also come to some larger understanding. In a reading or social studies classroom, and I think Tamar would agree with me, the far most important thing you need to think about as the facilitator of Harkness is the text you select and why you've selected that particular piece of text for a Harkness conversation. The first thing you want to think about are the essential understandings. How does this text help you and your students answer essential unit questions? How will it help them build historical thinking skills? Then you want to think about, how does this text tie in with the unit focus and theme? How does this text help students deepen their understanding of some sort of major historical event? Objectives. What targeted reading or history objective is being covered by the discussion of this text? Will they be thinking through causation or comparison? Is the text rigorous and on grade level? Is it appropriate for them to read and discuss? And then finally, voices and perspectives. What perspective does the source give us, and why is it important for students to be exposed to that particular source? What voice is missing and what perspective is missing? How can you enrich students' understanding by providing that alternative voice or perspective? Next would be an English language arts classroom. If you think English language art, you might think more traditionally literature. The diving into discussing of various novels, poems, short stories lends itself really wonderfully to a Harkness conversation. However, there are productive ways to have conversations tied to conventions around writing. You could have a Harkness conversation focused on writing skills and revision. You can ask students to connect their Harkness discussion to the essential question for the unit and write to express specific writing skills. Students could discuss and debate the quality of a piece of writing based on a rubric. They could evaluate a piece of writing that has a mistake or misconception that you've yourself noticed in the class, and they could diagnose the problem and suggest solutions. Another type of conversation you can have in an ELA classroom is Harkness to explore. So having students use those essential questions to explore a specific topic anchored in a text, and have that tied directly to the essential questions or unit. This could be used when you have a longer piece of text that you want students to pull out specific information or details from. And the last core content I'll talk about is Harkness in a math, and you'll hear a lot more from Teddy since he's a math teacher. But there are a few things you want to think about before Harknessing in a math classroom. The number one thing is you want to encourage opinions and different ways to approach and solve a problem. Otherwise, students don't have anything to discuss. The more higher order thinking questions you provide, they'll tend to lead themselves to different pathways and better discussions. If they're simple one-step linear equations, students aren't really going to have a fruitful conversation around that. You want to hold the table accountable for their learning. It's inevitable that students are going to teach each other, and that's what we want. You want to create an environment in which students make sure everyone at their table is learning as they go. You could tell your Harkness table that you're going to evaluate one student at the end of the class to explain, at the end of the discussion, to explain a problem. That way they're ensuring that everyone's understanding as they move through the problems. You also want to make sure students are putting their work up on the boards, the public display of work. And that's what, then they can show their work and explain it to their table. We have tons of mini whiteboards at TNA. I think we go through dry erase markers. I don't know at what rate, but they're used every day in a math classroom for students to show their work. You could have students either sign up for a specific problem at the beginning of class, volunteer, anything so they feel invested and they're sharing out about something that they're excited to talk about. Finally, you'll want to have students go back and reflect on perhaps a mistake they made after a Harkness conversation. After the tables moved on from a problem, go back and ask a student, so what did you do wrong in question 3 and what do you know differently now? That way a student can explain the mistake and avoid making the same mistake in the future. The next thing is we're going to watch a really short clip from Teddy's classroom. So that's the very beginning of Teddy's class, and I'll let him talk a little bit more about it, but it might have looked kind of chaotic, but that's the moment where his students are going up to the board to put problems on before they begin to share with their classmates. So that's just one thing to think about in a math classroom. I think the next slide is questions and answers. Oops, sorry, it's playing again. Thank you. Are there any questions? Were there any questions in the chat?
There are not, no.
All right. So next, Teddy will talk more specifically about how he's been able to execute Harkness in a math classroom.
Sorry about that. I'm trying to unmute right now. I think I'm working. Yeah. For some reason, I can't get fully unmuted.
We can hear you perfectly. Now he's back on mute. Actually, while Teddy, you're figuring out the mic, we got a great question from Sarah, which is asking, what is the difference between Harkness and cooperative learning? And so I think the way that I would describe the difference is Harkness is more of the students taking on that teaching role and having, I definitely know there's that level of responsibility for other people's learning through cooperative learning, but in Harkness, it is supposed to have the students do more of, have a strong cognitive lift.
Smart, thanks for that. And Abby, thanks for unmuting me there. I lost the option to unmute myself on the screen other than holding spacebar. So here I am, ready to go. Thanks everybody for the help. Yeah, part 4, from theory to practice. I'm Teddy Schreischun, math teacher from Pritzker College Prep. And I really just want to take some time to take the wonderful information that Paige and Rebecca and Tamar presented to you earlier in the presentation and show you my take on it and how I've used the theory of what they've done and modify, or the theory that they presented on, and how I've used it to modify my class to meet the needs of the community that I serve and the students that I serve. So as the presenters before me have shared, there's no one right way to Harkness. Harkness is more so ideals. Harkness is this target that you're aiming for. So I want to yeah, I want to just get to it and explain what's going on in my classroom. So first off, a few things. There we go. I think I just skipped ahead there. I want to make sure that we understand kind of the Venn diagram that we're working with here between me and you. I'm sure a few of the things that I'm going to talk about here we're overlapping on. So as far as Harkness, I teach Harkness as part of a whole, meaning my entire school does not do Harkness. I'm kind of on a pedagogical island. I teach Harkness in the math department, and there's no teacher in the math department that teaches all of their classes using Harkness. I teach all my classes using the Harkness method with some modifications that I'll get into. I have 25 to 36 students in my classes. There's a 300-point spread on the SAT math range as far as my students' SAT math scores. And then I don't have a Harkness table. So I have desks, and these are all probably things that you will be experiencing in your classroom as well as you dive into trying Harkness discussion. So if you want to try Harkness, I want to share some initial things that I had to consider. And one of them was something that Rebecca brought up, which was, do I want to do my class as a split class, or do I want the entire class to do Harkness together? So I chose to do the entire class Harknessing simultaneously. And so then naturally I had those two questions to answer: how many groups will there be, and where am I going to be positioned? So I landed on splitting my class up into groups of 2 to 4 students per group. So obviously this will change with class sizes. The number of groups that there are will change depending on the size of your class. But yeah, 2 to 4 students per group. And each group will have their own question to work on at the board. And then as far as where I'm positioned in the classroom, I'm moving around, floating around, going to every board, trying to visit every student, but I'm very intentional about the order that I do this in. And it has a name, it's called aggressive monitoring. And I start with the high GPA students when I start my aggressive monitoring, and I move to the lower GPA students when I'm doing this aggressive monitoring. So I want to try to put all of this together for you and what this looks like. I know I'm throwing a lot at you here. So first off, the picture, this weird picture that I have on here. This is just a gradebook report that I print off to create my groups. I'm a pretty lo-fi person. Maybe that came across when I couldn't figure out how to unmute. I swear I've taught Zoom classes all year. But in general, I like to keep things as simple as possible. So I put all my effort and energy into interacting with the students. And so I print off a gradebook report that auto filters my students from low GPAs to high GPAs. And then I create my groups using that. So I create homogeneous groups. And then once you have your groups, the next thing you might want to think about is, how do kids get to choose their questions? Am I going to assign them questions? Do they get to pick? Who gets to pick first, right? There's a lot of little questions to answer here as far as who gets to pick a question and go to the board and whatnot. So all the groups are going to go to the board and work on a question every day. And I start by letting the lowest GPA students choose a question first. So the lowest GPA group gets to choose the first question for the day. And I do this so that they have ownership in the class. I do this so they so they get to choose their own journey for the day. And you may think that lowest GPA students might be choosing the assumed easiest question for the day. Sometimes that's the case, sometimes it's not. Sometimes they like to push themselves. Just because they have a low GPA doesn't mean necessarily that they're not strong mathematicians, or that they don't want to engage in class. So it's really awesome to see what happens when you give the lowest GPA students in your class the first choice of questions. And then I ascend to the highest GPA students, allowing students to pick on my way up. And when I get to the highest GPA students, what's really cool about this is the highest GPA group is left with the assumed most challenging question of the day. So this order of question selection helps me scaffold my class in a really easy way that is completely owned by the students, so that they feel ownership in the questions that they chose and in the direction that class is going. So everyone's getting a challenge. Everyone's grouped with peers at similar ability levels as best as I can for that day and that unit. And yeah, and then we move on from there. It's great. I love it. I love it. And so the next thing is, how do I aggressively monitor? I basically, you can see all these weird notes and like little numbers and crosses, and you'll see little dots and little S's or things like that on my sheet there. That's me taking notes. It's kind of like a little coding thing that I've developed over the years to figure out how to interact with the groups and what groups I need to go back and check in on and what groups I need to monitor a little bit more. But with aggressive monitoring, as far as like which board I go to first to check in to see if students need help, I often start with the high GPA students with that group. The reason I do this, the high GPA students often just need a direction or a little nudge. So they just need, you know, maybe they're stuck about step one and you can tell them to go look at this book or look at the notes from this date or give them an idea using a vocabulary word. And sometimes they just need a little push, and then often they can kind of just unravel the problem from there. So those interactions are usually pretty brief. And then I work my way down to the lowest GPA group. Now, the lowest GPA group often has one of the less involved questions, or as far as rigor, it might be one of the lower rigor questions for the day. But I spend the most time with the lowest GPA students, helping them build their confidence in mathematics. What I find is students in my class that have low GPAs within a Harkness class, it's a multitude of reasons why they have this low GPA in my class, but it's not because of a deficiency in mathematics. Maybe there's some mathematical trauma. Maybe they just have low confidence in general speaking and presenting. But I mean, I love these moments that I get to spend with these students, because maybe they just need some immediate feedback to know that they're going in the right direction, or maybe they're fearful that they're going to do all this work and spend all this time and then realize that they did it wrong, which that has value too. But to build confidence, sometimes they just need someone there by their side cheering them on. And one of the most rewarding parts of being a Harkness math teacher is getting to presentations at the end of class where the students are presenting their work and taking questions from their peers, and seeing this lowest GPA group just crush it when maybe they didn't come to class with homework done at all and they had never seen this problem. They didn't prepare for class, but they still were able to learn. They were still able to teach. They were still able to articulate thought. And yeah, so this aggressive monitoring, I've found a lot of success in that to bolster the confidence of my lower GPA students in my pre-calculus class. So you want to try Harkness. So another initial thing that I had to consider, how do I grade participation in my class? Because class is essentially just nonstop participation. So what is participation going to look like, and how am I going to grade it? So some general participation concerns that have come up from teachers trying Harkness for the first time is subjectivity in grading participation, and then some unintended consequences of including participation as a grade. So as far as subjectivity is concerned, we want to try to avoid any type of bias going into a student's grade from the teacher's perception of that student, right? We want to avoid that meme there where it's like, ooh, participation equals do I like you? We want to avoid that, as we all know. And then the other thing that we want to avoid are these shallow conversations. You know, a student says something in class simply just to like get some participation points and get their grade up, but what they say maybe isn't necessarily fully meaningful or productive to the forward movement or progress of learning the objective for that day. So just some simple solutions as far as like grading and participation, and just some ideas to throw out there. These are things that I've tried and that other teachers have tried. So I just want to put out some simple solutions to you. I don't really want to flood your toolbox with too many things, but here's just a couple ideas. So very straightforward thing you could do, you can provide a rubric Transparency is wonderful for giving students ownership in their class. So a rubric or a diagram like this showing how many points you can earn for doing certain behaviors, where the grade will land depending on very concrete actions, like did I come prepared? Am I providing textual evidence? Like, am I referring back to the text, etc.? And this is a really beneficial approach if you're doing a first-time Harkness class and you're deciding to split your class. So if you want to split your class to the point where you can be fully focused and present on the group that is Harknessing and the other group that is not Harknessing is working independently, this is a really great solution. In order to use this rubric, though, the teacher does have to be fully present in the discussion, which when I do my full Harkness, my full class Harkness, I'm not fully present in every discussion at all times. I'm floating around the room constantly. So I actually don't use the rubric, but it's a really good device to use, or a really good strategy to use if you are planning on splitting your class and having half Harkness and half not. So another thing to consider is to just not have participation count as part of their grade. Any proponents of grading for equity would acknowledge that removing participation and teacher bias is actually a very equitable grading practice. And so, you know, I track notes, like you can see that picture there. I track who's participating and what they're doing and what questions they're working on. But I use these notes and the questions that they're on and things like that, and the little dots that I put next to students to check in. I use these notes more so to build relationships with the students and to have little mini conversations with them about their participation or about their engagement. Because often a lack of engagement or participation is simply just kind of the surface level, and getting down to why they may or may not be participating in the way that would be beneficial to a Harkness classroom. That's more important to me than just dinging their grade, and not that that's what teachers do, but yeah, I don't want there to be this this perception of do this, get these points, don't do this, I take these points away from you. I'm more about building relationships and using those relationships. Now, a little strategy that I use sometimes if I'm struggling to get a student to participate, and I get down to, like, maybe they have low confidence, or maybe they feel like they can't, or maybe they're showing up to class and they don't have their homework done regularly for X, Y, and Z reasons. I find that giving simple roles in the class and within your group is really beneficial. Giving a student a very targeted task to complete engages them in the work, and builds their confidence, and so that maybe the next day they have a better day, they can have a better lesson, and maybe they can contribute a lot more to their class because they have this sense of completion and this sense of success within this class that may feel foreign to them. So providing roles like a scribe, someone that makes sure that they write out explanations of work, you know, the why, having a reference expert, a student that's referencing a textbook or vocabulary, or things like that, and giving students references, having a visualizer, a student that draws a graph, having a student that writes out a common error, having a common error expert. So if they did go down the wrong path while solving and I redirected that, have them leave the error up and explain why it's an error and why they made that error. Have a student assigned to doing that is really empowering, especially during their presentation. And so you have a picture of a board there that had all four of those roles, and you can see the multiple handwritings and colors, etc. Yeah, so these are just some simple solutions to maybe some bigger problems that you could have in a Harkness classroom. And then another simple solution, and then I'll move on to homework in Harkness, but just one more simple solution to participation in grading. If participation is seeming shallow, if participation, maybe students aren't engaging with it, or students are, you know, putting subpar work, you know, you create these expectations as a class and students are not meeting those expectations. Sometimes it's as simple as just giving them an opportunity to speak to their peers before they go to boards to put the problems up. So in the picture up above, I created a turn and talk do now that we do at the beginning of every class, where we have math discussion expectations that we talk about. And this gives students the ability to come with their homework. They show up, they look at the homework, and they can ask students questions before they go to boards and maybe strategize which questions they want to work on, strategize which questions they need to get help with, and really build confidence before going to the boards and getting a direction. So that's one thing that I've seen really bolster participation, is having an intentional turn and talk moment. And then, as Tamar mentioned, creating culture at the beginning of the year is so important, especially if you're going to do Harkness as on this like pedagogical island, like I've mentioned. So be intentional about creating safe spaces for students to try and fail in math class. My students, this is a picture of a poster that they made in the classroom when we were talking about failure and trying and growth. And you see there's a picture of a drawing of a person walking across a tightrope, and they have two different scenarios. They could either walk across a tightrope over a pool of sharks, or they could walk across a tightrope over a safety net. And the students, we use this language. This is language that they visualized and they came up with. But if students are struggling, or maybe they're feeling pressure or tension, we reflect on is every individual being a strand of the safety net and creating a low stakes environment that then will raise confidence and participation, or is every student or individuals participating as sharks, creating these kind of high anxiety, low confidence scenarios. So culture, build classroom culture, and build it alongside your students. Have them be the leaders of that. All right, last one, I swear. So you want to try Harkness. Initial things I had to consider: what does homework look like in a math classroom for Harkness? Last little thing, last time you'll see that picture from the Muppet movie, the fork in the road. So yeah, what does homework look like in a Harkness classroom? So some general guidelines for a Harkness classroom as far as homework. On the right, you see a picture of a screenshot from actual Harkness math problem sets that the students would be given for homework. And general guidelines is that homework is for preparation. It's not for a student to take home and practice what they were doing the day before. It's for them to prepare for a discussion and to prepare to tackle problems. So students use the homework as discovery. They use these homework problems to discover new ideas and new concepts and new vocabulary. They use the homework to do that. And a big thing for these questions is they have to be very thought-provoking questions. They have to have multiple ways of solving them. Sometimes they're open-ended. Sometimes the questions, maybe they have a solution using a technique that the students had never seen. But the idea is to try to drive them to problem solve and to try to use the resources available and work together to get a solution and to get an algorithm, to get a method. But because of this, you give very limited quantities, right? The questions are very rigorous, so you need to give very limited quantities of the questions so that the students are spending most of their time on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. I think there's been nights where I'll just assign one question, and I'll have the entire class come back and we'll all work on that one question because maybe it's a question they got stumped on the day before. But those are some of the best conversations when the students have one question to work on for homework, which is kind of naturally what problems are like in the real world. Rarely do 30 problems come up all at once. Normally it's one that we have to spend a couple days working on. So it really mirrors, Harkness mathematics really mirrors these practical applications of problem solving in our lives. But a few solutions if you're worried about Harkness and things like that, right? Because some concerns that come from Harkness that might be coming up in your mind before I go into these solutions. Students could be coming from varying mathematical backgrounds. And so they might have varying levels of confidence or skill sets. So that could be an issue for giving students problems that they've never seen. Another thing is that you don't know what a student's like home life is. You don't know what their learning environment is. So you might have students coming really prepared and going all out and like having their board fully prepared, like their presentation fully prepared for every question when they show up. And then you might have some students that regularly show up with nothing, with a blank sheet of paper, with a blank worksheet. And so having to address those things. And then I think the other thing is that Harkness being a discussion-based math class, math can often be very, you can find success in math and be very insular and be very quiet and isolated. But pushing students to explain and to discuss can sometimes make students that feel really successful normally in a math class, it can make them shut down because maybe they're not the strongest presenters or maybe they're shy. And so they might feel like for the first time, they can't be successful in a math class, or maybe they can't contribute meaningfully. So I want to talk a little bit about those concerns and some simple solutions for first-time Harknessers if you're planning on doing math and doing Harkness in your class. So one thing that I do, I decided to start with foundational guided notes at the beginning of every unit. We go through general formulas and vocabulary that we define as a class, and we talk about this at the beginning of the unit, just to try to get all students on the same level, on the same playing field, so that they feel like they can access the problem. So that's one simple solution, is just have like one guided notes kind of structured teacher focused lesson at the beginning of the unit, and then do multiple days of Harkness discussion afterwards. Another thing that you can do, if you're worried about maybe students' work environments outside of class, like whether they have quiet places to do their work or whatnot, is just provide time in class for them to get started on their work. It's amazing what happens when you give students time and space to do the work, and how that levels the playing field for everyone. At the end of my portion of this presentation, you're going to kind of see a visualization of my thought on modifying for students and modifying on your class. And this kind of fits this. Give all students the time to work on this and do quality work within mathematics, and watch all of their presentations, all of their skills, all their abilities rise together. So yeah, just simple thing, provide some class time. And that's a little screenshot of my like unit schedule. So just provide some class time for students to work and get prepared. Before you start Harknessing. And another thing is consider adding modifications to your homework. So this is a homework example here. There's like a Harkness style question on the right. And then down below, you can see the hints that I've typed in. And so I push them to reference their notes that they've taken. You can see in like bullet point 5 there, it says use your new graph and what we learned in section 1.4 and 1.5. So referencing previous notes that they have, really pushing them to think about the vocabulary that we talked about, asking kind of guiding questions, etc. These are all really useful. These are all really useful techniques that I've found as far as like modifying homework to allow all students to access the homework and come in with better prepared presentations. So yeah, just a simple thing, add some hints and some modifications. So here's, I was alluding to this, but this is kind of my general direction and thought on just modifying mathematics or modifying learning in general, specifically for a Harkness class. So you have a little cartoon here, and you have a student in a wheelchair, and then you have students that are not in a wheelchair, and maybe they're going into school there, and you have this worker, this custodian outside shoveling the steps for the school. And they're shoveling the steps because he thinks to himself, all these students need to get in on the stairs, and there's only one student in a wheelchair that needs the ramp. But the student in the wheelchair is pointing out, if you just shovel the ramp, we can all get in. Skip shoveling the steps, right? Like don't like only modify for one student and only let one student benefit from the modifications. Modify for all the students. And if you write good questions and have good content, you have good class culture, every student will still be pushed to their limit if you design your classroom in a way that is beneficial to all students. But make sure that you're modifying for the ramp, not the stairs. because all students can really benefit from Harkness if you can get on board with that mindset. So yeah, I know I've talked at you a whole bunch. I wanted to take some time for Q&A before we wrap up the presentation today. So were there any questions? I know I spoke specifically about math class, but I'll try to answer questions on different topics if there are any. But then also just, we have a lot of really bright people here in the presentation today. So if I can't answer it, someone definitely can. Let me check through the chat real quick. Is there anything?
Eddie. Yes, we do have 3 questions, or 3 individual submitted questions.
Okay.
And so the first question is from Tanya, and the question says, about how often do you typically Harkness?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if I'm doing a unit, if I'm learning, if I'm going through kind of a multi-objective unit, let's say like exponential growth and decay, if I'm going to try to take 2 weeks to do this unit, I normally, let's say you have 10 days. I'll Harkness for probably 7 of those days. 7 of those 10 days, class days, are spent Harknessing. So a majority of my time is spent Harknessing. A majority of the learning happens through Harknessing, but I have some preparation days at the beginning and like a foundational notes day. And then at the end, when they take the assessment on it, I also have like a remediation day where the students can present on their mistakes and try to get points back on their quizzes and tests and things like that.
I know for myself that I typically try to Harkness 3 to 4 times a week once we start Harknessing. And so we have Sarah who submitted a question and Michael who submitted a handful of questions that are all really important to answer. We know that this is scheduled to conclude at 6:30 and we want to give you about 5 minutes for a survey. So how about we spend until about 6:25 answering questions and then transition to the feedback survey. We're very eager to hear your positives and pushes for this presentation. So to go in order, Sarah asked, are students encouraged to research the homework question and turn to other sources? I know for myself, I discourage students to do that since they are in 9th grade and I don't explicitly teach researching skills. I also want the conversation to be focused on the source that was provided. So for me, I say no, unless it's something that has to do with research. But go ahead, Becky.
Well, I teach usually juniors, and so although I don't explicitly like encourage or teach that, you'll hear at the Harkness conversation, students bring up something they looked up in connection to whatever they're discussing, which is really exciting because that means they were invested and interested and curious. So you'll definitely hear those or they'll come up to you after class and say like, I found this article about what we're talking about. So it tends to happen really organically. Students will start to do their own investigating just because they're curious.
Yeah, I find the same thing. I do a lot of front loading with providing resources for them to use. But then if a student shows up and they've found a different method, or sometimes students use websites, what I sometimes ask them to do is to, on their board, to reference the website so other students can go like look at it and verify it. Or if they like printed out a graph or like a step-by-step process, I'll ask them to maybe print it, or I'll tell them to share the link with me and I'll print it for them and they'll put it on their boards for their presentation as well. So I do love the organic resource usage, but I also make sure that to kind of level the playing field, I provide students with resources up front.
It looks like the next question from Michael is about how teachers learn how to use Harkness and how they are comfortable with it. At the Noble Academy, we send our new teachers to those summer institutes at Exeter. They have a math institute and a humanities institute, which it's a really nice week-long crash course into the actual experience of Harkness. So you're kind of put in the role of a student, so you know exactly what it feels like. We also at TNA have run a math institute on our campus. So we actually have Exeter teachers come and work with our math teachers, and then other Noble teachers can opt in, and it's opened. So that's sort of people's first introductions. At TNA, we will hold our own like in-house PDs for our new staffs at the start of the year and onboarding. And I think what people find a lot of value in is the culture of being able to ask other teachers in the building how to operate Harkness at TNA. You know, the institutes are really helpful because they allow teachers to build connections with those Exeter experts and see and feel what it looks like. And then I think they can use that to springboard into thinking through their own classroom. And then what's really helpful is going into Tamar's class and seeing what she does and using that moment to think about how to then implement it in your own classroom. I think everyone sort of varies with how quickly they feel comfortable and how soon I remember my first year teaching, I think after a couple, the first 2-3 weeks, we hit the ground running with Harkness. And you just everyone sort of works at a different pace, I think, but hopefully by the midway through of their first year at TNA, when we're in person, teachers feel comfortable executing Harkness.
Just for the sake of time, we want to make sure we have both. You've heard a lot of us talking today, but we did make a short clip of just some students talking about Harkness and their experience with it. So I want to make sure we have an opportunity to show you that. And then we will stay. There was a couple more questions, I think, in the chat. And so we will stay on after this video and the survey to just answer any lingering questions that people have.
I enjoy the fact that Harkness is a discussion, specifically a student-led discussion. I enjoy the fact that it allows me and my peers to become more social inside the classroom. It allows me to take the lead sometimes and put myself out there, even though sometimes I can be very shy.
That my favorite part of the Harkness method would be when there were multiple different interpretations or ideas about whatever material we were studying that day floating around the Harkness table. I think those conversations specifically allowed for richer discussion and thus a better understanding of whatever it is we were looking at.
Communication is one significant skill that I developed due to Harkness. What more can students ask for when they have an opportunity to discuss with their classmates on a free basis? I learned to adapt to many different situations and scenarios. No matter what subject it is, math, English, physics, or any subject, there was some type of skill developed in each one, whether it's with communication, critical thinking, problem solving, your confidence building, and more.
Hearing 8 or so different interpretations of a constitutional amendment breaks through that basic understanding of what it is into something more. And I think that's part of the reason why the Harkness method has made me a better student. It's taught me how to think critically about every piece of information that I'm given. And most notably, I think it's taught me how to disagree, whether that be with my peer or with some 16th century philosopher, and how to do that in a constructive and clear way. And I think I've definitely had to use that in all of my college discussions, be that outside of class or inside of class.
All I know is that whichever skill Harkness pushed more into, it allowed me to take that skill and build upon it and carry it outside the classroom and apply it to all sorts of situations. Harkness not only benefits inside the classroom, but it also benefits outside the classroom.
Okay, we just wanted to show that quick video. Both of those students attended TNA, and as you can see, they're both in college and they've graduated. But I think what's clear from that video is that, they talked a little bit about the academic content, but I think what stood out for both of those students more is the soft skills they develop and the confidence they develop and the ability to go into a discussion in their college classes and be able to hold their own and talk with their peers and communicate. And that's really what Harkness is about, is making sure that we have students that leave high school and feel like, you know, I am able to engage in this discussion. I'm able to discuss. I'm able to make a path forward towards a solution and feel that confidence. And that's what I think Harkness really gives the students the ability to do. All right, so here is our contact information again. We really appreciate everyone coming to the webinar today and listening a little bit more about Harkness. This is also on the graphic organizer in case you want to follow up specifically and have specific questions. And then the last thing we would love for you is just give us some feedback. We will put the feedback survey in the chat right now. If you could take a few moments just to fill that survey out, and then the four of us will stay on this call to answer those last couple of questions that came through the chat. Or if there's anything else that comes up, please feel to unmute and ask or put it directly into the chat.
Do you help? Okay.
Did we answer Carrie's question about, is Harkness only meant for certain kids? I think we did, right? Teddy's explanation of how he works with students with differing levels of academic readiness, I think answers that. Did we answer that, Carrie? I think so.
Sorry, I was taking the survey. Yes, you did. Thank you very much.
Very good. So folks, thank you all for staying through this very content-rich and exciting webinar, I want to say. Please fill out that one-page survey. And if any of you want what I call continuing professional development units, the very last question on that survey asks you to insert your email address, and we will make sure that you get that. So make sure you provide your email address should you want CPDUs. But in any event, please fill out the survey because we would love to hear, as would the presenters, as to what you took away from this presentation. And with that, I think we will bring this to a close. Presentation team, please stay back for a few minutes for a debrief.